exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what we do at Kung Fu Podcast. I'm your host, Sifu T.W. Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode number 87. If you're a first-time listener here, welcome. I hope you'll find this program educational and sometimes entertaining as well. I'd like to recognize a few folks that have gotten in touch with me. Mr. Mickey Moyle out of Perth, Australia, wrote me, says, "Your podcasts are so inspiring, sir. Thank you so much, and I get a lot out of them." Thank you to Paul, who sent me the wonderful gift from Japan. I got the scroll hanging up, and it looks awesome. Thank you again. Thank you to Martha, who started supporting the program at our Patreon account. If you'd like to find ways to support this program, you can go to kungfupodcast.com/support. All of you that have contributed to helping us get Steve Baskets the wooden dummy is happening. I got an email from Anthony, and they told me they were purchasing the wooden dummy today. So that's fantastic news, and I will hopefully be getting some pictures and video of Steve working out, and I'll share those with you when I get it. Kung Fu Podcast, the program is evolving. I know that the bar of expectations for this program is raised quite a bit over the, say, 15, 20 episodes. Partly because of your input and your request, and then also my personal drive to want to do a good job, and doing that as consistently as possible. This particular podcast, The Lies I Have Told on Martial Artists, is not one that I will ever forget. Have you ever worked on something, let's say a technique or a form, got very frustrated with it, put it down, came back, worked on it again and again, and then you realized that something was fundamentally incorrect? If you haven't, lucky you, because that has happened to me more times than I can count in Kung Fu training. The moment that you realize that there are no more corrections or adjustments to be made, you need to start over, build it from scratch, do it again. It is the first time it has ever happened to me at this magnitude in podcasting. Hours of research, note-taking, reference checking, then planning this podcast. I made a multi-hour recording just about a week ago. I was in over an hour and a half into the editing process, and it hit me. Something's not right. The message and the stories were not as woven together as well as I wanted. I was missing a few connections. I stopped, I took a walk, went outside. Fortunately, it was a nice spring day. And I thought about whether I could patch it up. I considered that as a possibility. And then I thought about you. I regularly tell you that the audience of this program are some of the finest and sharpest martial artists in the world, and I mean that. How could I possibly put out a product that was a patch-up job, and doing that out to a community of people that I know work hard on the craft? They expect good of themselves and afford me their time to share what I have learned along the way. The answer is I couldn't, so I walked in and I hit delete, the whole thing. I sat back down to a blinking cursor. And let me tell you that a blinking cursor can be an intimidating and relentless presence. It just sits there saying, "I'm waiting on you." I started over, and I feel a lot better about what I'm going to be presenting with you today. This podcast was stimulated by an essay written by Dr. Daniel Amos, Lies I've Told on Martial Artists. It opened my eyes to a history and current-day presence of marginal communities and the role that groups play in it. I created a summary for this episode titled Marginalized Communities and Martial Artists. A link will be in your show notes and on the website so that you can have a PDF file sent right over to you. This relationship between martial arts and marginal communities is a topic that I became fascinated with. The history and the culture of this changing phenomenon that applies to a single person or to masses of people. I'm going to be addressing at least 4 questions that came to me during the research. What role has marginal communities had in the development of martial arts? What role has martial artists had in the marginal communities? What are the triggers and aftermath of martial artists that are marginalized? What role can martial arts play today in marginalized communities? Then, as part of an indirect result of the research, I will share 4 reasons that you could find yourself on a watch list because you are in a martial arts community and the public is being trained to observe for particular behaviors on a checklist. And some of those behaviors you train in regularly. Let's start with an old but recent story of a community that has been marginalized for a long time. The Okinawan population have long been reported as having a strong feeling about getting more control in their political and economical decisions. These are two areas where masses of folks can get their frustrations up quickly. Another, as you will hear about several times in this episode, is a lack of justice. Now that will fire up masses of emotions quickly too. Before I share this with you, my disclaimer. Let me make sure that I honestly let you know that I do not have a political interest in either major party here in the United States. Or should I say that I have a political interest in both parties. I try to look for and hope that those folks that want to be a political leader have the best interest of the people in their charge as part of their forethoughts in decision making. I would like to believe that we all hope for that, more so than a hope that a particular ideology is exercised till it all takes us to our doom or someone else. So with my disclaimer being said, on February 19th, 2016, University of Chicago Democrats writes, quote, known as the Keystone of the Pacific, Okinawa boasts easy access to China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and much of Southeast Asia. The bases are in part a remnant of the Cold War. U.S. bases on the islands were used for troop stationing and refueling during Vietnam. Vietnam-era Okinawa was U.S. occupied, while the U.S. occupation of mainland China was officially dissolved in 1952. Okinawa remained under U.S. control until 1972, when the U.S.-Japanese reversion agreement returned it to Japan. What's left of America's Okinawan occupation is the U.S.-Japan Status of Forces Agreement, which has kept the majority of U.S. bases in Japan on the island. Crimes committed by U.S. servicemen against Okinawans, noise pollution from the bases, environmental issues, and a myriad of other complaints have led 80% of Okinawans to oppose the bases as of 2013, yet little has been done to change the island situation. The problem is threefold. Okinawans bear the burden of being seen as irrelevant to the U.S. military and second-class citizens to their own government. Meanwhile, the Japanese government is subordinate to that of the U.S., and therefore cannot even protect the Okinawans when it might like to. The U.S. government prioritizes the military defense of an entire region over the frustrations of the people of a small island, and Okinawa remains the most strategic location for this defense." End quote. Now, many smart folks may argue whether this is the right thing to do or not for political or rural military strategic reasons. However, there should be no argument that it is the Okinawan people that have been marginalized through this process. And this reaches way back into the history. Napoleon was informed about this magnificent weaponless land, which you will hear more about when I get to an essay on how marginal communities affect the development of martial arts. The Japanese flag flew in Okinawa in 1872. The Asia Pacific Journal writes an essay titled Okinawa From Disposal to Resistance. In it, they discuss how in March 1945, Okinawa was served up as a sacrificial offering to save Japan 50 years later. There are headlines in September 1995. A 12-year-old Okinawan schoolgirl was raped by 3 U.S. servicemen, not far from the military base on the island. In the article it says, quote, "The question is, can certain groups or certain people be marginalized in international affairs and national security?" End quote. On a personal note, I would love to see the Okinawan people free of foreign military bases and rule, unless it was something they elected to stay with. But the point here is that they have long been marginalized. Before we go any further, we need to define marginalization because it is a multi-layer, changing subject. The dictionary definition of a marginal community is to regulate to a powerless or unimportant position within a society or a group. This can be a single individual in a small school setting or masses of people inside of a country. BusinessDictionary.com says, marginalization is the process whereby something or someone is pushed to the edge of a group and accorded lesser importance. This is predominantly a social phenomenon by which a minority or subgroup is excluded and their needs or desires are ignored. So being marginalized is not a comfortable experience at all. Oftentimes a marginal community is one that is poor, of lower status, of lower education. They're the ones that do not necessarily have all the essentials regularly, or certainly they have little to no extras. Often this group is denied involvement in mainstream economic, political, and cultural activities. Sometimes a marginalized community does not even receive the same access to protection, justice, or other services. Marginalized communities throughout history and to this day tend to simmer to a point till they boil. And it is this boiling point that terms like rebels, uprising, revolts, vigilantes begin to emerge. A couple of other operating definitions here, and friend of the program, Dr. D.S. Ferrer, has been helpful in my understanding of the different types of almost surgical-like researchers that get involved in these studies. And one of those types of surgical approaches is ethnography, or ethnographic study. It is the systematic study of people and cultures. It is designed to explore cultural phenomenon where the researcher observes society from the point of view of the subject of the study. It's basically like an embedded journalist. One other term that engaged my interest in this research process was social capital. It is very real and it is intangible. It is like a currency that you cannot count, but others know when you're spending it and you know when you have it. I was listening to Dan Carlin's interviews over the past week, and if you've never taken a listen to Hardcore History Podcast, I'd encourage you to pick a topic and take a listen. The Wrath of Khan podcast audiobook was a great influence on me to consider how I approached this program. In an interview, Mr. Carlin discussed how toughness is a topic that many historians will not touch with a 10-foot pole, because toughness is abstract, it's subjective. You can't give a test to define it. It's not really a fact, it's a judgment. Toughness is more of a humanities question. Was this generation as tough as that one? Social capital is also intangible, similar to toughness in that regard. Being marginalized as an individual or as a group leads us to seek out social networking or community. This natural seeking is the third level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Once we get ourselves out of harm's way and have a little stability, putting together a community is next. The community helps us begin to develop social capital. Being marginalized puts us in a position where we want to create a social network to find social capital through bonding and bridging. The voluntary social networks that we're going to be looking at in this episode are gangs, religious groups, and, of course, martial arts groups. Let's explore now how marginalized communities are defined by the academics, the mechanisms that can trigger the marginalization, and some of the results. Here are a few examples in the U.S. and the U.K. today. Carolyn Kagan of the Department of Psychology and Speech Pathology at Manchester Metropolitan University. She wrote about social marginalization, and she says, quote, "Marginalization is a slippery and multi-layered concept. Whole societies can be marginalized at the global level, while classes and communities can be marginalized from the dominant social order. Similarly, ethnic groups, families, or individuals can be marginalized within localities." Ms. Kagan goes on to explain that marginalization is a shifting phenomenon, and that, for example, individuals or groups might enjoy high social status at one point in time, but as social change takes place, so they lose this status and become marginalized. As life cycle stages change, so will people's marginalized position. A second academic wrote, "The Handbook for Social Justice in Counseling Psychology, Leadership, Vision, and Action." Now, did you hear the title of those three words? Leadership, vision, and action. These are three words that are almost pillars in many martial arts schools. In 2005, written by Rebecca Toporek, Ph.D., she's also an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling, Career and College Counseling Specializations at San Francisco State University, and she published a 632-page, 2.7-pound book. A quick Amazon description of this textbook says, "It's a conceptual roadmap of social justice and social action that they can integrate into their professional identity, role, and function. It presents historical, theoretical, and ethical foundations followed by models of social justice and action. The examples in this handbook explore a wide range of settings with diverse issues and reflect a variety of actions. The term otherness is used, and it alludes to that there is this large group and then there's others. I think of synonyms like outliers or the fringe of society. Chapter 11 of Dr. Toporic's book is titled Marginalized Communities in the United States, Oppression and Social Justice. This chapter focuses on ways that counselors can support members of marginalized communities in the United States through social action. There are 7 categories of otherness identified and commonly experienced in the United States society. Folks who experience otherness are done so due to race and ethnicity, gender, religion, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, and physical, mental abilities. Oppressed groups who experience exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and violence, although the degree and form of these aspects of oppression may vary across the different groups. And the last academic current example of marginalization. In the UK 2013, there's an article titled Mental Health and Well-Being of Marginalized Communities. The article discusses the Public Health England view on the boundaries, challenges, and opportunities in defining public mental health practice. In this particular instance, marginalized communities are on the edge of not getting services that others may receive. A sentence taken from the article reads, "The committee also encourages the state party to seek means to expand the services of the helpline of the General Directorate of Social Services and the Child Protection Agency in order to reach out to marginalized communities in rural areas." These are 2 very common government services, social services and child protection, and they are in lack in some of these more fringe communities. These were 3 examples of marginalized communities as they're defined by the academics today, and the mechanisms that can trigger the marginalization of these folks, such as gender, beliefs, sexuality, and some of the results that happen from them. What is the relationship between marginalized communities, the culture, the adventures, and how they have impacted martial arts? In KungFuPodcast.com/80, the Southern Chinese found themselves much more marginalized than many of the Northern Chinese community. Social status was much lower. The presence of justice, the presence of food, medicine, government services were lacking, and protection from bandits, pirates, policing to thwart homosexual and heterosexual rape, and other criminal activities was almost non-existent in many communities. It was this massive cultural marginalization in southern China that impacted the development of civilian martial arts. The skills of hand-to-hand combat, grappling, and creative weapons, such as farming implements, were all exercised during this time. These people trained together. They created bonded social capital inside a community, and if communities could tie themselves together, it could provide them bridge social capital. Think of it as a fantastic community watch program in your neighborhood. Often these rebellions, vigilante groups, and revolts don't happen spontaneously. They usually build out of growing tensions that stimulate responses. Take, for example, Sasha Matuzak's essay titled To Topple a Dynasty, Kung Fu Rebels and the Cycle of History. He writes, quote, "The last time China's government collapsed was just over 100 years ago, when the Qing dynasty fell after almost 4 centuries of rule. The fall did not happen in a day, ranging instead over a century of unrest and violence that began around 1850 and ended in 1950 when the Communist Party consolidated rule over most of the country. So for nearly 100 years, communities were in turmoil. Fundings were directed to militia and militia support. Police and other protective services were lacking to non-existent, but the taxes kept pouring in." Sasha also writes, "The martial arts played a critical, prominent role in the rebellions and warfare that tore the nation apart and eventually toppled the emperor. 4 rebellions in particular put the role of the martial artist in times of social unrest into perspective and also helped place the current martial arts infrastructure in China into stark contrast with the institutions that existed 100 years ago. These rebellions are the Red Turban, or Opera Rebellion from 1854 to 1855, the Red Spears Uprising, powerful in the 1920s and 30s, the Boxer Rebellion, 1899 to 1901, and the most destructive civil war in the history of mankind, the Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864. Well, who made up this rebellion? The Opera Rebellion, or Turban Rebellion, included some marketplace performers, or acrobats, and martial artists associated with opera troupes, but most of the rebels came from an attractive cast of Pearl River pirates, thuggish boatmen on the Grand Canal, destitute farmers, and low-brow commoners of every stripe and color. The Red Spear rebels were civilians that forged a paramilitary system from about 1920 to around 1935, when the communities were being triple taxed and receiving nothing. These various forces were taking the taxes and paying for their military objectives or purely for oppression reasons. KungFuPodcast.com/62 takes you through the development, routines, and effectiveness of this civilian martial community that became a factor in the chaos of the time. These are 4 examples of martial arts groups that developed from marginalized communities. Later you'll hear about these groups that are active today. When we're looking at social networks, things like martial arts groups, our friend Ben Junkins over at Kung Fu Tea asks, what value, if any, do networks of relationships and trust bring to society? Ben states that most of his work is in smaller voluntary groups, such as religious groups and martial arts associations. This voluntary social network conceptually is a way for us to find a community, a network, and to build our social capital. These social networks are built on what is defined as either a bond or a bridge. And I will give you an example of the development of a bonded social network. 2 of my students are working out on focus mitts. They're working on combinations of hands, and the last 2 strikes were much up near the face and throat. The mitt holder, the receiver, says, I'm going to hold it up here near my head because I trust you. Building trust amongst your members is very important in the development of social capital. Taking your school and developing a good relationship with, let's say, a law enforcement agency up the road is an example of bridge social capital. There is also another group, like martial arts associations and religious groups, that people find social capital. Going deep into history and today, the participation of gangs. The involvement in organizations like these can be either voluntary or involuntary, and you will find both bonded and bridge social capital in all of them. You also have to be aware of the downside too. These bonded and bridge networks can be used to help support individuals and communities, but they can also be used to help keep people out. If you've ever had to deal with a group that is tied into a good old boys network and you couldn't get through, you just experienced the informal but very powerful bonded and bridged good old boys network. It is not always a government or military system that forces the marginalization of communities. As you will hear about later, criminal elements like gangs, mobsters, and mafia can marginalize and oppress a community until the community develops a social network through bonds, bridges, then they can rebel to regain justice. When society starts to look for justice, the term vigilante is used. By definition, vigilante is a member of a self-appointed group of citizens who undertake law enforcement in their community without legal authority, typically because the legal agencies are thought to be inadequate. When civilians form their own forces to fight off oppression and have a sense of justice, it can get rough for everyone involved. I'm going to be sharing with you a current-day story of a group of martial artists who have formed their own vigilante group to fight off a criminal network, and the police don't seem to have a problem with it. There's a book by Scott Decker. It's called The Handbook of Gangs, and in their textbook, you will find prominent issues written by scholars surrounding gangs, religion, and martial arts. On page 222, the authors are discussing boys' behavior, including gang and violence involvement, is a reflection and result of their cultural values of distrust, shame, family honor, and warrior mentality. They go on to say, it is young men's economic and culturally marginalized position, coupled with their conceptions of what it means to be a man, that results in banding together for power and violent protection of territory and community, specifically women and children, as a means to uphold honor and manhood, end quote. This really gives you a feeling of the undercurrent of when people, in particularly this case, masses of young men, are put in a marginalized position. They have a sense of honor, a sense of family, and what it means to have honor and protecting their families. And this puts them in that position to bond together in direct opposition to oppressive forces. We're going to circle back now and probe the development of karate, as it is related to a marginalized community. Jack Slack, a very well-respected author at Fighting Vice, and you can find a couple of his excellent essays posted over at Ian Abernathy's forum. Mr. Slack wrote an article titled, Fighting Motives, the Kingdom of No Weapons. The Kingdom of No Weapons looks at the economical, political, military, and civilian history that could have stimulated the development of Okinawan karate. This has become a higher interest of mine, and I intend to research this Chinese martial arts and Okinawan karate development to share with you on a later episode. In regards to a marginalized community in the development of martial arts, Mr. Slack writes, what makes the development of martial arts in Okinawa interesting was the geopolitical and social circumstances surrounding it. He discusses an island disarmed. The area surrounding the island of Okinawa was perhaps perfect for the creation of a civilian martial art. Closely linked with China and Taiwan through trade and conquered by the Japanese, Okinawa's unique geographical position nurtured the development of a martial arts tradition, but another factor essentially forced the development of a local martial art. What was once three kingdoms became under one rule, one king. The Okinawan people were disarmed by the 15th century to suppress their resistance. This made it forbidden for landowners to keep weapons. Not even the island's elites were permitted to carry a bladed weapon, which leads to improvised weaponry. Since weapons were banned by the government, the Okinawans came to rely on what they had around them to defend themselves. The Okinawan people had to develop improvised weapons to protect themselves. One of these weapons is called a tonfa, which is remarkable because I remember when my dad was sent for training in the highway patrol, and he came back home, and the weapon he brought back was nearly identical. He would take me out in the backyard with my brother and show us how it worked. Mr. Slack's article primarily focuses on the how karate started and who was involved. But he is such a well-respected author, I wanted to include his reference here. The Okinawan Karate website says, it was the act of banning weapons that drove the original indigenous Okinawan arts and the Kung Fu organizations underground. These organizations were in fear that they would be persecuted for practicing their fighting methods, and this led to a very high level of secrecy in the training. This is something that we hear about in various cultures, where a marginalized group starts to develop a network, bonds, and bridges, but they're forced to go underground in order to protect themselves and exercise their skills. Much like the ban that Kublai Khan had put out on weaponry that could challenge his military, it was the ban itself that promotes the development of hand-to-hand combat, pugilism, grappling, and other pieces of art, including the development of practical weaponry. This ebb and flow of tensions was also well described by Gary Krug's article titled At the Feet of the Master, 3 Stages in the Appropriation of Okinawan Karate into Anglo-American Culture, and as well another article titled Constructing a Martial Tradition, Rethinking a Popular History of Karate-Do by Kevin S. Tan. In a summary, Mr. Tan, who I've written, and he has given me permission to share his entire academic research essay with you on an up-and-coming podcast, says that karate began and evolved with changing cultural concepts. He writes, quote, although now commonly framed as a Japanese or Oriental martial tradition, karate was never a direct creation or invention of any one particular culture form or political interest. The construction and subsequent reconstructions in light of changing historical and political climates may be described as a structure of conjunctions, where the martial tradition of karate is often a dynamic interplay between the various cultural logics as they constantly encounter and reinterpret each other throughout history. The historical fate and future of Karate-Do then is one that can never be apprehended through a rigid and linear understanding of the process of history making or narrow claims to essentialized notions of culture. Therefore, only through the adoption of a multi-stranded and critical approach would one be able to appreciate the fullness of any seemingly empty hands." End quote. So the academic researcher Kevin Tan states that karate was never a direct creation or invention of any one particular cultural form or political interest. I believe that this is going to be a really good essay to read and share. There's also an interesting article over my friend's forum, Ian Abernathy. Would karate have been better off if it had never made its way to Japan? The perspectives shared on their forum are wonderful and insightful. Reading that article led me into researching another question that I didn't have any idea what the answer was going to be. What happened to the relatively small group of martial artists that was left behind when their martial art left to go to Japan? We know what happened with karate of Japan. It exploded. But what about the guys that were left behind? Now, I've already had this discussion with a couple of my Okinawan black belt friends and one student. I know that they have a good sense of what happened to these high-level martial artists after the art left for Japan, but it doesn't seem to be as much common knowledge. The ones that were left behind didn't appear to be marginalized in the sense of being oppressed, but after karate hit Japan, it changed, and some will say that it may have even saved karate. But it intrigued me about the ones that were left behind, and I found that there were still plenty of questions out there, like at the Bushinkai Academy, where they have an entire essay written called The Lost Master, Anko Azado. Another popular karate practitioner, and somebody who's becoming a friend to the program, you may know as Karate by Jesse Enkamp, wrote an article on a Chinese historical figure known as Wu Shengui. He is better known in the karate world as Go King Ki. This particular story is one that sheds light onto the Okinawan karate experts that were not the big winners in karate after the martial arts were taken out to Japan. Near the beginning of the article, Jesse states that he is often asked why he doesn't write about this Okinawan training method or, quote, obscure Okinawan karate style, end quote. And Jesse writes, well, here's why. Because sadly, most people are not interested in weird karate masters and original styles from Okinawa. Most people are not interested in archaic training methods, orthodox karate teachings, and or stuff that's not popular. We like popular stuff. We like stuff that other people do. We like famous Japanese 3K, kata, kihon, kumite, punch-kick styles from Tokyo. We are sheep, end quote. The implication that these Okinawan karate experts became even a smaller part of the community to the point they were almost considered relics, and certainly didn't seem to receive the same recognition as some of the counterparts that were associated with the Japanese versions. Jesse has given me permission to share the entire article, which I will do on a later date. And who knows, I don't know the answer to this. We could easily find that the status of folks who were once considered relics may have become treasures. So we've considered folks in masses and in groups, but what about a single person, a single martial artist marginalized in a single school? Let me tell you a quick, recent story from Kai, the author of an upcoming blog, budoinochi.com. She shares how she practiced Aikido, felt she was ready to broaden her horizons and try some other Aikido dojos. She knew that it was different early on because she came from a hands-on martial arts school where they applied their techniques firmly, and this new dojo was very light and gentle. She said that the folks at the new dojo were very kind and cerebral. Then the first time her teacher asked her to be the uke, or demonstration partner, he applied a lock and a takedown that didn't work. She didn't go down because she was used to being controlled firmly by the classmate or the teacher. And he said very quietly, "Go down." So she simulated what would have happened if he had applied the proper technique and went to the ground. After that, she started to sense that the instructor didn't like having her in the class. She was now involuntarily marginalized. Soon after that event, using the wooden swords with another student and her sensei standing right there, the other student smashes her hand, apologizes profusely, and the sensei, as she writes, didn't care, didn't offer even first aid or to look at it. Her finger had been broken. She states that she never went back because it was starting to feel very creepy. Kai goes on to write about the insights and reflections that she's had since she had the experience, but for our purposes, it's an example of how quickly someone can get marginalized in a single martial arts studio by the teacher. And my last examples of unvolunteered marginalized martial artists are some of you, because I know for a fact that some of you have felt oppressed or held back in your own school, because some of you have had religious orientations that were different than what the school had stated it was based in. Gender issues have long been a problem in martial arts. A couple of you have confided in me that you felt like an outcast due to the objectives that you have in your training. You wanted to practice a philosophical or health-oriented approach to your martial arts and were outcast because they were training for tournaments. It does happen, but again, it can shift too, which I will use as a segue to Dr. Daniel Amos, ethnographic researcher who gave me permission to share this with you. Dr. Amos is very well respected in the field of research. Ben Judkins over at Kung Fu Tea says that Dr. Amos's work was very helpful to him. And in fact, Ben wrote, quote, Dr. Daniel Amos is a pioneer of modern ethnographic research on the Chinese martial arts. His work opened a window onto the social world of Southern Chinese martial artists, both in Hong Kong and Guangzhou, during the late 1970s and early 1980s. This was an incredibly important time in the spread of the modern Chinese fighting styles, making his detailed observations all the more important, end quote. In a 2014 interview with Ben, Dr. Amos responds to a few questions about practicing Chinese martial arts. And Ben asked, what was it like to study Chinese martial arts and martial artists in late colonial Hong Kong and post-cultural revolution Guangzhou? Dr. Amos says, in Hong Kong, the brothers and sisters in my master's martial house were from the lowest social classes, marginalized by society at many levels. Although I come from an ordinary U.S. family, with both my parents having working-class roots, in Hong Kong I benefited from the privileged position I found myself in. Hong Kong had been run by the British for a century and a half, and like the rulers of this place, I was white and a native speaker of English. Ben asks, do you have a favorite style? And Dr. Amos says, I love the Southern praying mantis style that I've practiced now for nearly 40 years. The next question, are Chinese martial artists today still a socially marginal group? And Dr. Amos says, I think the short answer is probably not as much as before. A good many Chinese martial artists are still socially marginal, but a number of my Kung Fu brothers and sisters in both Hong Kong and Guangzhou have had successful careers. There are many more opportunities for Chinese youth now than there were 4 decades earlier. The number of places for university students has exploded in both places. When I first went to Guangzhou, the 5 luxuries were a watch, a bicycle, a tape recorder, a camera, and a washing machine. In Hong Kong, where I lived in the New Territories, many people in the mid-1970s did not own a watch or a camera. My Kung Fu younger uncle in Guangdong Province now owns a 4-story apartment house, several SUVs, and runs a string of Chinese medicine shops. My most talented Hong Kong martial arts brother immigrated from Hong Kong to Europe, set up a martial house there, and then a restaurant and a hotel. Unfortunately, he died in his early 50s from the effects of alcoholism, as did my 70-year-old Guangzhou martial arts master years earlier. Heavy drinking and alcoholism seems to be associated with contemporary martial artists, a theme that has long been depicted in classic Chinese novels and popular martial hero fiction. So Ben asks, you have had the opportunity to closely observe the Chinese martial arts for 40 years now. We frequently hear warnings that Kung Fu is dying as young people refuse to take up the practice. How valid are these fears? And Dr. Amos says, the death of Kung Fu is highly exaggerated. In Hong Kong and Guangzhou, social and economic life are much richer than before. There are vastly more opportunities to attend technical schools, colleges, and universities, and after graduation, find well-paid employment or pursue a business career. There are also many more leisure attractions and distractions, but the transmission of martial skills to the younger generation still occur. As you read through that part of the article, you'll hear Dr. Amos talk about the transmission of martial skills still occurring with a different sense of priority and necessity than before. A generation change over using the martial arts approach to social advancement and networking to an educational approach to social advancement. It is really good to hear that folks that were marginalized and barely receiving an education were able to provide better opportunity for their children. And this leads us up to the essay, Lies I Have Told About Martial Artists. Ben writes, quote, Dr. Amos will tackle a number of questions regarding a researcher's ethical responsibilities as they first become members of and then report on various, often marginal communities. While the political situation in China, following the end of the Cultural Revolution, threw these issues into stark relief, they are a topic that no ethnographer can afford to ignore, end quote. March 17th, 2016. The essay begins with Dr. Amos joking with a friend that he had not actually done ethnographic fieldwork in Guangzhou, China, or the British Crown colony of Hong Kong, but rather he invented his studies of Cantonese martial artists while he was enjoying the sunshine at Santa Monica Beach. But once he's through joking, he goes on to mention an interesting character named Carlos Castaneda. Castaneda was Amos's classmate at UCLA before he became a doctor. They shared mailboxes, the same dissertation chair, and had many of the same anthropology faculty members on their dissertation committees. Wonderling.com says of Castaneda, in the world of writing, both fiction and nonfiction, Carlos Castaneda is deemed to be one of the most controversial authors and figures around. The article goes on to say that the supporters of Castaneda are usually found in the spiritual, occult, or shamanism realms and not the academics. Several have said that his writings doesn't come close to truth. And then, quote, even if there is an element or thread of truth weaved throughout his series of books, they are not to be taken seriously, end quote. Dr. Amos says that Castaneda was accused of poetic license, of embellishing the details of his well-known accounts. Edmund Leach, the eminent social anthropologist, reviewed Castaneda's first work and said, quote, this is a work of art rather than of scholarship, end quote. Even though Dr. Amos's classmate doesn't have much credibility in the academic realm, he does say it is probable that our ethnographic writing shares at least one trait. All the characters that appear in my ethnographic descriptions of martial artists in southern China during the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s are fiction. My fiction, however, differed from that of my famous schoolmate in that I considered my study to be largely a political study. During 1976 to 1981, while I performed dissertation research in impoverished socialist Guangzhou and comparatively wealthy colonial Hong Kong, I felt Chinese martial arts in both places could be partly understood as a form of cultural play that illuminated and revealed conflict between social classes. Now as we move forward through Dr. Amos's essay, as a member of a gang or of a martial arts family, you could inadvertently fall on the radar of police and governing agencies. This is a very important component of martial arts history to remember, as you will hear more about in a bit. Dr. Amos continues, quote, ultimately, the fictionalization of my ethnographic writing about Chinese martial artists was generated out of concern for protecting the privacy and personal identities of the participants in my study. In Hong Kong, from the beginning of the colonial rule through the end of the British rule in 1997, practitioners of Chinese martial artists who belonged to martial arts brotherhoods were suspected by the colonial government of being involved in criminal activities, organized crime, and members of triads. A Hong Kong police report prepared in the 1970s by the Hong Kong Triad Society Bureau stated that 1/3 of independent Hong Kong martial arts brotherhoods were associated with triads and engaged in criminal activities. This Triad Bureau report says that in many local gymnasia, particularly gymnasia associated with more traditional forms of Chinese martial arts training, served as the local headquarters for triad social factions, especially in respect of local enforcement work. A percentage of the staff, managers, instructors of such establishments are known to be or suspected of being triad officials or active triad members. Of the 419 such establishments in the colony, 141 of them are suspected of triad associations. So this police report had identified the gymnasiums where these folks were doing traditional forms of Chinese martial arts as local headquarters for triad factions. But Dr. Amos says, quote, "Although I could not definitely prove it, my own biases led me to feel that the strong official association of martial artists with criminality was exaggerated, generated out of natural fear by the ruling and middle classes of a mobilized and semi-militarized segment of the impoverished and working poor. In a society where there were no guns, except for those carried by the local British-led military and police, the higher social orders felt anxiety about working-class youth and adults who developed martial skills within their own voluntary associations," end quote. So the higher-ups, even though they had guns, were getting pretty nervous about the development of these young folks, especially when it came to martial skills. So it sounds identical to the problems that the senior leadership was having with the young men who were developing martial skills when we talked about the Phoenix Village in episode number 51. We have seen this relationship between gangs, martial arts, and religious groups repetitively. Some stories are easily dispelled as false. Some have very detailed accounts, such as the one we did with the white eyebrow system, where gangs, politics, tax collections, police, and monks, all in episode number 84, featuring Chung Lai Chun. So that's a look in some of the history, and some of it not too far back. But let's roll it up 40 years, September 23rd, 2015. What are people prepared to do when they feel marginalized, almost terrorized by the criminal element? Fightlin Vice wrote an article titled "Brazilian Martial Artists Form Vigilante Gang to Fight Teenage Beach Thieves." In Brazil, about a year ago, there was an essay about a group of the Sao Paulo Brazilian police that was trained in jiu-jitsu to help with crime issues. They carried no other weapon but their martial arts, and the plan worked out well. The officers went out with their jiu-jitsu, issued arrests with fewer civilian and police injuries. But what's developed since then, after the World Cup ended, there was an economic downturn in the country. The divide and rift between the richer and the poor have become greater. And now in the very city that is to host the 2016 Summer Olympic Games, Rio de Janeiro, there has been a rash of crimes called the Dragnet. This dragnet is described as a sort of siege from large groups of poor teenagers from the local slums. These teenagers descend upon the tourist beaches of Copacabana, Ipanema, and several others en masse, running through the crowds and terrorizing sunbathers, tormenting cops, snatching purses, cell phones, and other valuables. It has gotten so unbearable that the civilians have been taking up arms, even creating vigilante groups. Recently, 30 mixed martial artists in Brazil organized themselves and recently formed their own vigilante committee to deal with the dragnet. According to the members of the vigilante committee, they searched buses looking for young men who don't look like they have a penny in their pockets. They say that they're not doing any sort of racial profiling or class discrimination, and they also swear that they're not hurting anyone, and the police has not interfered with them taking a posture that they're not going to be held hostages by this dragnet. I do think it's important to remember that in defining a vigilante gang, it doesn't mean that they're lynch groups or a character like the Punisher. It is when civilians pick up the scales of justice when the police is unwilling or unable to. In fact, vigilante is a term which is derived from its Spanish equivalent, which means private security agent. Vigilante committees were common here in the U.S. For example, there was the San Francisco Vigilante Group of 1851. They disbanded, and when the city administration of San Francisco became corrupt, they formed again in 1856. When the Reno Gang terrorized the Midwest, and no success of catching them from law enforcement, the Southern Indiana Vigilance Committee formed, and they captured the leaders of the group while they were in the middle of robbing a train. But let's move up to something else that is current. January the 14th, 2016, Oliver Lane posts a story titled, "Police Crackdown as 13,000 strong anti-rape vigilante groups emerge across Europe." That was January 14th, 2016. These civilian-based enforcement groups are in the thousands. They are using instant messaging applications to notify one another of crimes and to respond. Rapes, sexual assaults, and robberies without a satisfactory number of arrests is stated as the stimulus for these protection groups in Germany, Austria, and Finland. Just like in the 13th century, civilians didn't feel satisfactorily protected from their governing police forces. They find ways to network, communicate, actively seek out, and respond to the criminal element. These small criminal groups can marginalize the public, but then when the public has had enough, there's going to be a response. It also appears that martial artists of the old days that just focused on the physical culture of combat could easily have fallen on either side of the law. You could have found the martial artists protecting the local gambling house, prostitution house, and because of that element, those who didn't sometimes got caught up with those who did. Dr. Amos states that he knew Hong Kong martial artists who, while they were not members of criminal triad gangs, would suffer physical, psychological, social, economical, or legal harm, or they would suffer damage to their dignitary standings if his writing exposed their identities and their behavior. He states, quote, "I knew Hong Kong martial artists who were alcoholics, opium users, organizers of dog fights and gambling, butchers and sellers of dog meat, gay and transgender martial artists, frequenters of prostitutes, those with sexually transmitted diseases, martial artists who could not read, unemployed martial artists, and martial artists who were undocumented immigrants. For this reason, I wrote fiction, not identifying individuals, but attempted to describe a variety of cultural scenes related to martial arts in Hong Kong." End quote. Dr. Amos states that his concern about protecting the identity of these participants in the study of martial artists even got higher because of the Mosher Affair. The Mosher Affair is where Stephen Mosher, a Stanford University anthropology student, had conducted research in Guangdong Village for several months, from the end of 1979 to the beginning of summer 1980. Mosher was the first anthropology graduate student from the United States permitted to do ethnographic research in mainland China since the end of the Cultural Revolution. The Chinese authorities repeatedly complained about Mr. Mosher's behavior during his time in the Guangdong province. They abruptly ended his study, and he was not permitted to remain in China. Dr. Amos states that as far as he knows, he was the second U.S. graduate student to do research in China during the time. He continues to say that Mr. Mosher violated the fundamental rule taught to every ethnographer in the field, and that was researchers were obligated to protect the participants of their study. The Code of the American Anthropological Association states clearly a basic requirement. In research, an anthropologist's paramount responsibility is to those he studies. When there is a conflict of interest, these individuals must come first. The anthropologist must do everything within his or her power to protect their physical, social, and psychological welfare and to honor their dignity and privacy. What had happened was Mr. Mosher had discovered that some Chinese women had been forced by local officials to undergo involuntary abortions, sometimes even late in pregnancy. In May 1981, Mosher wrote an article for a popular Taiwanese magazine and took no care to disguise these women's identities. He published the article with photographs of the women. By publishing their photos, he clearly identified and exposed them, and they were subjected to punishment by the Chinese government. Stanford University Academic Committee investigated Mosher's case. They interviewed Daniel Amos about the incident. Amos said that he had nothing that he could add to their investigations. Based on information gathered from the academic committee's investigation of the affair, Stanford University produced a report. They expelled Mosher from the university's anthropology program. I wish I had an applause button right now because I'm very glad that they expelled Mosher out of their program. Dr. Amos says that he doesn't know the fates of the women that Mosher exposed to harm, but he hopes that the damage that they experienced from Mosher's selfish, reckless actions were not severe. Since that time, more rigorous institutional safeguards for research with human subjects have been implemented. Dr. Amos states that many of his martial arts subjects would have suffered if he would have exposed their identities. Some hated Chairman Mao and the Chinese Communist Party. Others engaged in gambling and fighting. Some were alcoholics. Others had premarital sex, which was then an illegal activity. And many others had positive, uncritical fantasies about developed capitalist countries and hoped to immigrate. Dr. Amos lived in Guangzhou, and he practiced Kung Fu with a private martial arts brotherhood. He woke at 5 a.m. and rode his bicycle several miles to get to practice. Because of the sensitive nature of his research, none of the martial artists with whom he practiced Kung Fu appeared in the pages of his dissertation or early publications. The identities of the martial artists he wrote about were changed. The martial artists that he did describe in detail had already left the People's Republic of China, or they were residing in Hong Kong, Macau, overseas, or were deceased. Basically, none of the descriptions portrayed any martial artist then living in the People's Republic of China, and any similarity to any individual residing in China was strictly unintentional and coincidental. So we can see that Dr. Amos went to great lengths to protect his martial arts subjects, unlike Mosher, who threw the women in his study under the bus. An interesting component of Dr. Amos's essay is where he talks about he's recorded all this material of martial artists, which includes Super 8mm film, video recordings, books and books of field notes, articles and works about the Chinese martial arts. And his primary advisor, Barbara Ward, who is described as brilliant, generous, and a creative anthropologist, sticks him with the question, what are you going to do with all this marvelous ethnographic data? And Amos said that he had no idea. She hands him a copy of a book, James Louis' work, The Chinese Knight Errant, published 1967. In it, James Louis discusses how martial arts have long been associated in Chinese culture with knight errantry, an ancient symbol of resistance against social constraints. He describes the Chinese knight errant as a playful warrior who is rebellious, loyal to friends, altruistic, courageous, and an extreme individualist who despises society's conventions. Amos states that Louis' knight errant sounded a lot like some of the martial artists he knew in Hong Kong and Guangzhou. Dr. Amos says that the point his primary advisor was making when she handed him that book is that you can have a mountain of good ethnographic data, but if you don't come around to having an accurate and useful understanding of what you've discovered, it can be useless. So he has used the ideas of his mentors, friends, and of the scholars that he admires to analyze the data about martial artists that he had brought back with him. He closes by saying, quote, "It is my hope that the lies I have told about Chinese martial artists have been honest ones, protecting them while adding some light to the field," end quote. We can see the passion that Dr. Daniel Amos has and the love he has for the practice and research of martial arts. We can see the lengths and reasons why he protected their identities. Well, how many folks today volunteer for a group called martial artists? I assume that you volunteered, or at least you are volunteering to participate and excelling in the craft of martial arts. I say assume because I do occasionally hear the 12-year-old say, "I'm here because my daddy makes me." That's what we call involuntary participation. But we do know that martial art practitioners are a tiny, not a small, but a tiny portion of most present-day communities. Simmons Market Research studied the number of people participating in martial arts in the United States in 2011. 5% of adults say they participated in martial arts at least once in the past year. Of those 5%, a quarter of those say that they do martial arts every chance they get. So the regular martial arts practitioner represents only 1.25% of the American population as of 2011. This number was split 52% men to 48% women. Quorum.com references the Australian Government Institute of Health and Welfare report, and they state there is good research which measures around 1.6 of the Australian population took part in a combat sport in the previous 12 months, which is similar to a number of around 1% for UK adult population as reported from the General Household Survey. It is safe to say that if you practice martial arts regularly, you are part of approximately 1.5% of the population that does. So the next time you're in the group of 100 at the grocery store and something goes sideways, don't assume anyone else has any training or experience. You might get lucky, but don't count on it. Assume you're flying solo. So why would someone volunteer, whether historically or today, to practice in this microscopic percentage of the population? During this episode, I've given you some ideas of positive reasons why you might join a martial arts group and then also some things you might have to watch out for. But picture, if you will, that the martial artists in your community were rounded up and interviewed. Who have you practiced with? What types of techniques do you practice? Does any of your training include delivering a fatal blow? Of course, if you explain that you're practicing practical martial arts for self-protection, that should be sufficient. You could let them know, I avoid problems where I can. I work on de-escalating things. And my ultimate objective is simply to escape, every time. Well, that seems sound enough to me. But it's not always the like-minded we're trying to explain ourselves to, is it? September the 8th, 2015, Rocket News 24. It's a Japanese news agency. Headlines read, Canadian airport staff interrogate Japanese tourist over strange martial arts weapon in his bag. Well, it turns out that this martial arts weapon was only an innocuous beauty aid popular all over China. The young man wasn't even a martial artist, but it looked like martial arts gear, and since they were Asians and in pretty good shape, it captured the attention of the airport staff. And I hear you, that's an isolated attempt, nothing to be concerned about. And I wouldn't say that you need to be concerned, but being aware of how things are changing, being aware of what civilians are being taught to look out for, and that you also know on the homelandsecurity.ohio.gov website, they list potential indicators of terrorist activities. This site carries the FBI and Homeland Security seal on it. Then there is also a local sheriff's office, in this case, the Osceola Sheriff Office in Florida, that has on their website a page stating, quote, Crime Prevention Information, Potential Indicators of Terrorist Activities Related to Martial Arts and Paintball Activities. They pose the question of what you should consider suspicious related to individual appearance, general behavior, and communications. There's a laundry list of bullet points, but let me read a few for you directly from the sheriff's webpage, informing the public to be aware of someone who shows, quote, interest in learning offensive moves in a confined space, interest in learning the use of hidden weapons, interest in learning kill and restraint techniques with no occupational need, individuals who together are interested in learning group tactics. They also state things like being aware that there could be training reference manuals and that everyone in the group clearly submits to one leader in that group. Of course, they're not trying to target well-meaning martial artists. If you're out practicing your forms and such in a regular community, there's probably never going to be a problem. But I think it would be naive to think that every community is the same, and that you may want to be aware of what the general public, the other 98.5%, are being taught to look out for. The fact is that the public is being taught to watch out for specific behaviors, like on a checklist, and training requests that are deemed a warning sign. And if you're a martial arts instructor, You would also want to be aware of individuals that come in making hasty requests to learn certain techniques and skills. But my intent is to finish this episode on an upbeat note. What role can martial artists have in marginal communities? Being a tiny 1.5% of the population doesn't mean that you can't have a massive impact on a marginalized community. UNUSYouth.com is an international organization that helps young folks. Their main team operates in the United States, Brazil, and Morocco. They have a very good article on a martial artist, a young lady named Alexandra Fuller, out of Boston. In an article titled that she is the founder of Level Ground Mixed Martial Arts and a social enterprise that empowers marginalized young people to fight for their dreams on and off the mat. Alexandra is determined to use sports to empower young people in marginalized communities to realize their true abilities and fight for their dreams. She created Level Ground Mixed Martial Arts, an athletic training business that offers mentorship, academic advancement, and youth employment opportunities where much of the youth live in poverty. At Level Ground Mixed Martial Arts, they are passionate about their students' growth on and off the mat. Alexandra's social venture has gotten kids off the streets, connected them with meaningful jobs, and into college. Now I'm going to read you one of the several testimonies from their webpage, and I can't lie, when I first read them aloud, I got a little bit emotional, and I'm going to do my best to present this well. Young lady writes, "My name is Alessandra, and I'm 16 years old and work with Level Ground as a program assistant. In my last 1.5 years, Level Ground has impacted me personally in a very significant way, opening up so many doors for me and my brother, who is also in the program. Since I was a child, I had to watch my father go in and out of prison. I had a rocky relationship with my mother and often felt like nobody cared for me. As a teenager, I suffered from depression, occasionally to the point of self-harm. My anger grew stronger and realized that something had to change to avoid hurting myself or others. Level Ground has helped me to see through my anger and the scars on my arms by allowing me to release my emotions in a positive way through jiu-jitsu. It has shown me that I have strength on and off the mat to overcome life's challenges. I now have a support system that offers warmth, joy, and opportunity. They help me see what I'm capable of. Level Ground has given me a mentor that has helped me build a resume and a variety of professional skills. I have also been given a job where I get to teach jiu-jitsu to middle school students and work toward a certification as a fitness instructor. Additionally, I take photos for Level Ground. In the future, I want to become a photographer and use the lessons I've learned at Level Ground to make a change in society and the outlook on poverty, violence, and the less fortunate. I want to inspire people to change these problems and become more considerate to those affected by them. Thank you for helping me get there." Well, thank you, Alexandra Fuller, for the work that you're doing. Let's all hope that we can influence each other, our communities, and the young folks like this. Think about it for a moment. We've shared all this information. So a guy or gal comes into your school in Argentina, the UK, Arizona, wherever, and they say that they're a researcher and ask if they could observe you all, see how you live, how you train, what you do, what you believe. What is your opinion on world events and your country's responses to those events? How free are you just going to give up that information now? Personally, I see a little trust and relationship building going to have to happen first. And before I close, did I address the 4 questions I started with? What role has marginal communities had in the development of martial arts? We looked at historical and current events where communities that were marginalized, oppressed economically, politically, or they were just lacking a satisfactory justice system, and how martial arts of various types were developed and enhanced. We learned that gangs, religious groups, and martial groups are paths that people may volunteer to in order to find a social network and develop social capital. The man card was also played out. It's young men's economic and cultural marginalized position, coupled with their conceptions of what it means to be a man, that results in banding together for power and violent protection of territory and community, specifically women and children, as a means to uphold honor and manhood. What role has martial artists had in marginal communities? The martial artists historically fell on either side of the law and could have been painted as either those that are trying to free good people from oppression or contributing to the marginalization. May I take a CFO moment here and send out a personal request? If you are a martial artist of any kind, of any style, any system, of any place, and participating in the marginalization and oppression of any other individual or group, stop it. Find a church, find a temple, find a mountain, and go live on it. But do your soul and the rest of your martial arts brothers and sisters some good, and don't contribute to the problem. In regards to the vigilante activities, I can honestly say that I could see both sides of that issue. You want to have justice protect you and your family, but when it's not present and it keeps coming, where do you draw the line? The third question I had was, what about the triggers and aftermath? We learned that many of the triggers were things that some you had no control over, like your gender, others like a religious choice, your sexual preferences, and many other things. We also found that sometimes you could get marginalized as a martial artist if you were just close to or associated with other people who are involved in bad deeds. The aftermath in many of these things were just going to be some form of a very uncomfortable situation. Then what role can martial arts play today in a marginalized community? And I would like to think that the sharpest and finest martial artists in the world are doing their very best to offset oppression and marginality in small bites or in big chunks where they can. Hopefully by offering classes, groups, sessions, or just reaching out. Remember that it isn't about the techniques or the styles that you teach. It is about you providing a place that students can learn to trust you and each other. You can reach out and bridge with other groups and other agencies that want to help marginalized communities. You as a martial artist can play a pivotal role in a marginalized community. In regards to the 4 to 5 potential indicators of terrorist activities related to martial arts, that information may not have been new for you, but it was for me. How you decide to use it or not use it is totally up to you. NetworkWorld.com says that the activities like these, quote, began when the White House announced a community-based approach to fighting domestic terrorism, and the strategy is to strengthen cooperation between law enforcement, communities, and the federal government, end quote. The New York Times printed on March 27th, 2016, just less than 2 weeks ago before I recorded this, where they print, it's going to be communities that recognize abnormal behavior. And they state that the National Security Advisor of the Times says that truancy is an indicator of possible gang activity. He said, quote, truancy is also going to be an early warning sign for violent extremism, end quote. In that article, the New York Times states that there's frustration due to the preoccupation with research that can be distilled into simple checklists, even at the risk of casting unnecessarily suspicion on innocent people. So it will be important to you as a martial artist to be aware if someone is pressing you to learn certain tactics or techniques without a clear reason why. The first question I was ever asked when I decided I wanted to learn Kung Fu was, why do you want to learn Kung Fu? And my answer was as clear then as it is today. I want to get to know myself. Performing the volumes of research for this podcast was very educational for me. At a social level, to understand the very similar dynamics of religious, gang, and martial arts groups, all with different objectives, but their position and roles that they play inside of marginal communities have and continue to be influential. As a martial artist, you'd also want to be aware that our world is changing and how it is changing around us. If you've elected to exercise the skills and the strategies and develop the craft of civilian martial artists, you have volunteered yourself to the tiny percentage of the population. Now, I'm very proud to be part of that group, and I'm also proud to get to know you all. Know and practice well that you're a martial artist. It's going to come with some risks, some benefits, a brotherhood and a sisterhood that can extend well past the styles and systems that we practice. It is also about time that some of the unnecessary infighting was put down, and we look out for each other more rather than looking down at one another. Thank you to Dr. Daniel Amos for giving me permission to share with you his story. If you happen to find a copy of the 1967 Chinese Knight Errant, grab it. I put a link on the show notes and website for Amazon. It's $175. The good news is the shipping's only $4. Remember that I created a 4-page PDF summary of this particular episode, Marginalized Communities and Martial Artists, that you can get at a download. It should be on your show notes. If it's not, it's on the website. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode number 87, where we explored the history, the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts in marginalized communities. This is Sifu T.W. Smith, and I'll be talking with you again real soon.